Family Guy kills characters constantly. They get shot, blown up, crushed, or erased, only to return in the next episode. But across more than 400 episodes, a small group actually stayed dead. And the most iconic death of them all wasn't caused by Peter. It came at the hands of his own daughter. In this video, we break down every Family Guy character who died and never came back. Section 1. Mr. Weed. Jonathan Weed showed up in the very first episode of Family Guy. He was Peter's boss at the happy-go-lucky toy factory in Quahog, a small, uptight man with a tidy sweater and a way of carrying himself that made it clear he had worked very hard to be taken seriously. The first time audiences saw him, he was walking the factory floor, checking up on the safety inspection process, and finding Peter Griffin asleep on the job with a butcher knife and a porcupine sitting in the toy pile, completely unchecked. That moment told viewers everything they needed to know about the dynamic between these two. Mr. Weed was a man trying to run a respectable operation, and Peter was the obstacle between him and that goal, every single day, without fail, without any sign of improvement. What made Mr. Weed work as a character in those early seasons was the patience. He would scold Peter, he would fire Peter, and then, because the plot demanded it, he would rehire Peter, and the whole cycle would start again. There was something almost fond about it, in the way a man might be fond of a stray dog that keeps eating from his garden. He never stopped being exasperated by Peter, but he also never stopped giving Peter chances. In one early episode, after Peter managed to accidentally steal an autographed baseball during a brief stint at the factory, Mr. Weed rehired him on the spot. That baseball mattered more to his boss than any number of workplace disasters. That tells you something about who Mr. Weed was. A man with odd priorities and a forgiving streak that was probably not good for him in the long run. From the very beginning, the show peppered in quiet hints about Mr. Weed's personal life. He preferred the company of men. In one episode, a co-worker caught him in the locker room in a situation that required no further explanation. In another, a new hire named Guillermo was described in terms that suggested Mr. Weed's interest went well beyond professional evaluation. When Peter once broke the lower portion off a replica of Michelangelo's David and threw the fragment through his office window, Mr. Weed named it Eduardo and kept it. The show never made a direct statement about any of this, but it kept adding details, and over time the picture became clear. Mr. Weed was a man who kept a lot of himself private, who worked very hard, who maintained a professional exterior at all costs, and who seemed, in small ways, to enjoy the chaos that Peter brought into his orderly life, even as he complained about it constantly. His name also carried its own quiet joke. In one episode, Brian asked him about it, and Mr. Weed explained that the name had been given to his grandfather when the family arrived in America. Then he leaned over and told Brian his real name was Bermuda Grass. It was exactly the kind of detail that Family Guy loved in those early years. A thing dropped into conversation and then never mentioned again, like a piece of furniture in a room you only see once. Season 3 of Family Guy was airing in 2001, and the show at that point was still finding out what it wanted to be. The format was loose in those years, more episodic, more willing to let a joke sit for a minute before moving on. Peter had been working at the happy-go-lucky toy factory since the beginning, and audiences had settled into the rhythms of that world. Mr. Weed was part of those rhythms. He was not a character anyone was worried about. He was background, reliable in the way that recurring background characters always are, present without requiring too much thought. The episode that changed everything aired on September 5, 2001. It was called Mr. Saturday Night, and it started as a story about Peter worrying that he was stuck in a dead-end job. His son Chris had brought him in for career day at school, and the response from the other kids had been underwhelming in a way that clearly got under Peter's skin. Mort Goldman, the pharmacist, got a better reception. That stung. Lois, seeing that Peter was feeling small, suggested he do something about it. Her idea was to invite Mr. Weed to dinner, a nice meal at the house, a chance for Peter to make a good impression, and maybe the beginning of a conversation about a promotion. The dinner itself went well, at least at first. Mr. Weed arrived and found himself charmed. He told Peter he was impressed with his home, his family, and what he called the funny talking dog. Then he mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he was planning to promote Peter to head of toy development. The room changed. Brian, overwhelmed by the news, began choking on a dinner roll. Peter and Lois rushed to help him, performing the Heimlich maneuver. And when the roll finally came loose, it shot out of Brian's mouth and straight into Mr. Weed's. He began to choke. There was confusion, then panic, and then Mr. Weed was dead on the floor of the Griffin dining room. The manner of the death was specific and absurd in exactly the way early Family Guy liked to be. A bread roll, bounced from one set of airways to another, ended a man's life at the moment he was about to do something genuinely kind for the person who had caused him the most professional grief in his career. The cruel timing of it was the joke, and the show leaned into that cruelty completely. Death even showed up at the door afterward, claiming there was a random dead body search being conducted in the area. Then Death admitted he had been joking and left. Mr. Weed's body was still on the floor. Peter's immediate response was to panic about what to do with the body rather than to grieve. He tried to flush Mr. Weed down the toilet, which did not work. The show treated the death not as a tragedy to be processed, but as a logistical problem to be managed, and that choice was deliberate. Family Guy in those years was building a reputation for finding comedy in places that other animated shows would not go, and the sudden death of Peter's boss at a dinner party designed to advance Peter's career was exactly the kind of dark turn the show was comfortable making. At the funeral, Peter attempted to convince his co-workers that Mr. Weed had promised him a promotion before he died, using a mustachioed hand puppet to make his case. Nobody was convinced. The co-workers stood there in their grief and watched Peter Griffin use a puppet to argue about a job title at his boss's funeral, and the show did not comment on how strange that was. It just let it happen, which was somehow funnier than any punchline could have been. Then came the will. Mr. Weed had left a videotaped will for his employees, and the lawyer who played it accidentally began with the wrong tape, which showed Mr. Weed in his underwear, making breakfast, being filmed by a male companion. The lawyer fast-forwarded past that section with visible embarrassment, and then the actual will began. Mr. Weed announced that upon his death, the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory was to be demolished and replaced with a disease research institute. The building came down immediately. Peter and all his co-workers were out of a job. That outcome was significant in a way that took a few episodes to fully appreciate. Peter losing his job at the toy factory was not a temporary setback that would be resolved within the episode. The Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory was gone. Mr. Weed was gone. The entire setting that had anchored the first 2.5 seasons of the show was simply removed, and the series moved forward without it. Peter spent several episodes trying out new careers. He became a fisherman. He founded a group for overweight people. He briefly and unsuccessfully tried to earn money as a street prostitute, which Brian did not take well. Eventually, he landed at the Pawtucket Brewery, which became his permanent workplace for the rest of the series. The transition worked, and in hindsight, it was necessary. The toy factory had done its job, but there were only so many stories available there. The brewery opened up a different set of possibilities, and the character of Angela, introduced when Peter started at the brewery, became a significant recurring figure across many seasons. None of that would have been possible if Mr. Weed had survived that dinner roll. Still, the question of whether Mr. Weed was truly gone took a little while to settle. Early animated shows had a habit of treating death as provisional, something to be reversed when the plot required it. Family Guy itself had already played with this, since Death was an actual character on the show, capable of appearing in any episode and interacting with the cast. The rules around Death were loose, and audiences had no strong reason to believe Mr. Weed's death was different from any other. Over time, it became clear that it was. Mr. Weed did not come back to life. The Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory did not reopen. The show occasionally brought him back in a different form, as a ghost, appearing in scenes involving deceased characters, but he was always presented as genuinely dead. His ghost turned up in a hallucination Peter experienced during a later episode, sitting on a cruise ship with other characters who had died over the course of the show's run. That image confirmed his status without making a big moment of it. He was on the dead character boat, and that was where he stayed. What Mr. Weed's death established, even if no one recognized it as such at the time, was that Family Guy was willing to remove fixtures, not main characters, not the Griffins or their immediate circle, but the recurring figures who gave the world of Quahog its texture. Characters like Mr. Weed existed in that second tier, familiar enough to register, but not so central that their loss would collapse the show around them. His death proved that the second tier was not safe, and that the show's writers were comfortable letting a character go when the story called for it, even if the story was a dinner roll launched from a dog's windpipe. There is also something worth noting about timing. Mr. Weed appeared in the very first episode of Family Guy. He was there before the show knew what it was, before the format had settled, before the cast of recurring Quahog residents had fully taken shape. To kill a character with that kind of tenure, even one who was never truly central, was a statement about what kind of show Family Guy intended to be. A show where history offered no guarantee of safety. A show where the rules of cartoon logic, which said that background characters were inviolable because they were needed for the background, did not necessarily apply. Audiences at the time mostly processed his death as one element of a funny episode. The episode itself was about Peter's attempt to become a Renaissance fair jouster, a storyline that took up most of the running time after the dinner party disaster. Mr. Weed was the inciting event, not the focus. His death moved the plot, and then the plot moved on from his death, and the show continued. That pattern repeated itself with almost every permanent death that Family Guy would go on to commit over the following 20-plus seasons. A character would die in a way that was funny or shocking or both. The immediate aftermath would be used for story, and then the show would continue. No extended mourning period, no constant callbacks. The character would simply stop appearing, and over time their absence would become the new normal. Mr. Weed, then, was the first example of something that would quietly become one of Family Guy's more distinctive habits. A show that died and came back multiple times over the course of its own history. A show that regularly killed its characters as a punchline and then brought them back without comment, was also a show capable of committing to a death and holding that line for decades. Mr. Weed established the pattern. His name was Jonathan Weed, his real name was Bermuda Grass, and he choked on a dinner roll at the worst possible moment, and then he was gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mr. Weed set a quiet precedent that most viewers never noticed at the time. Up next, the death that hit much closer to home, when Family Guy killed someone in Peter Griffin's own family and never looked back. Section 2. Francis Griffin. Peter Griffin had two fathers, and he killed both of them. The first one he crushed accidentally at a birthday party. The second one he won over by out-drinking him in a pub in rural Ireland. Only one of those endings counted as a death, and only one of those men had spent the better part of 2 decades making Peter's life miserable in the name of God, the Catholic Church, and the disappointment of having raised a son who turned out the way Peter did. Francis Griffin was Peter's father in every way that actually counted growing up. He was there for the bad report cards, the failed jobs, the years of watching his boy stumble through adulthood without any sign of improvement. Francis was a strict Irish Catholic man with deeply held opinions about how a person should live, and Peter failed to meet almost every one of his standards, on a fairly regular basis, without much apparent effort to do better. The relationship between them was defined by that gap between what Francis expected and what Peter delivered. And the show mined that gap for years before deciding to close it permanently. From his earliest appearances, Francis carried a specific kind of weight. He was not a cartoonish villain. He was recognizable, the kind of father who believed very hard in the things he believed in, who never updated those beliefs, and who made his disappointment known clearly and often. His faith was the organizing principle of his entire personality. He attended church, he quoted scripture, he had real opinions about the Pope, and those opinions sometimes put him at odds with the actual Pope, which the show used in a memorable early episode where Francis was hired as a Vatican assistant after failing to respect the pontiff's authority on the subject of Peter's interfaith marriage to Lois. The Pope, in that story, found a clever way to make Francis useful by giving him a job and getting him out of Peter's life for a while. Francis took the job. It solved the immediate problem and said something honest about how the character functioned. He was easier to manage from a distance. His feelings about Lois were not warm. Francis had wanted his son to marry an Irish Catholic woman, and Lois Pewterschmidt was Protestant, which in Francis's accounting was close enough to a personal affront. On Peter and Lois's wedding day, he reportedly attached a sign reading, "To a Protestant whore," beneath the "Just Married" sign on the back of the car. He also had complex feelings about Lois's German heritage. The show never treated these views as admirable, but it also never made Francis purely monstrous. He was a man shaped by a very particular set of circumstances and time period, rigid in ways that made him difficult, but also capable of love in the limited vocabulary he had available for it. Brian the dog received the Bible across the back on at least one occasion for questioning Francis's faith, which suggests that Francis's tolerance for intellectual dissent was essentially zero. That detail, the physical Bible to the back of a talking dog, captures the character fairly well. He was not subtle, and he was not interested in debate. What the show understood about Francis was that his constant presence in Peter's life was meaningful precisely because Peter cared about his father's approval and could never quite get it. That tension never fully resolved itself while Francis was alive. Peter would attempt something, Francis would judge it harshly, and by the end of the episode, they would arrive at something that resembled a temporary peace, which would dissolve the next time Francis appeared. That was the loop, and it worked because both men were consistent. Francis never stopped expecting better, and Peter never stopped failing to deliver. The episode that ended all of this aired on February 11, 2007. It was the 10th episode of Season 5, titled Peter's Two Dads, and it began at Meg Griffin's 17th birthday party. The party was the setting, but not really the subject. What mattered was that Peter, at some point during the proceedings, decided to dress as a clown and ride a unicycle down the stairs. This decision was made with Peter's usual complete absence of foresight, and the result was that he lost control on the way down and landed on his father with enough force to cause serious internal damage. Francis was taken to the hospital, and he died there. His final words to Peter were a condemnation, calling him a fat, stinking drunk. Those last words were not a surprise. They were almost perfectly in character, which was part of what made the moment hit differently than a lot of other deaths the show had done. Francis did not have a tender farewell. He did not tell Peter he loved him or that he was proud of him in some hidden way that had never come out before. He said the thing Francis Griffin would say, and then he was gone. And Peter was left with those words rather than something warmer. The death itself happened in the way Family Guy deaths often did in those years, as a consequence of something absurd. A unicycle at a birthday party is not a weapon, and Peter had no intention of hurting anyone. The show did not frame it as a tragedy in the traditional sense. Lois and Brian, when they stepped outside after hearing the news, celebrated on the front lawn. They high-fived. Brian grabbed Lois and wagged his tail in a way that required her to smack him into the garbage cans, and then they walked back inside, wearing appropriately mournful expressions. The show held both things at once, the genuine weight of a father's death and the equally genuine relief that this particular father was no longer going to be a problem. Peter's grief was real, or at least as real as Peter's emotional responses ever got. He was haunted by the last words. He felt the weight of having been the one who, however accidentally, ended his father's life. He gave up drinking, which lasted about as long as that decision ever lasted for Peter, and then Brian suggested he see someone about it. A hypnotherapist helped him access a repressed memory from childhood, and what came out of that memory changed the entire direction of the episode. Francis was not Peter's biological father. Thelma Griffin, Peter's mother, had kept this secret for decades. She had an affair, 40 years earlier, with an Irish man who now lived in a small village across the ocean. Francis had known the child was not his, had raised Peter anyway, and had never said anything about it. That detail, revealed after Francis's death, added a layer of complexity to everything the show had established about their relationship. Francis had chosen to raise a child that was not biologically his, had maintained that choice across a lifetime of frustration and disappointment, and had never let on that any of it was a choice at all. His last words to Peter were still what they were, but behind those words was a man who had committed to something fully and stubbornly, in the same way he committed to everything else. Peter and Brian traveled to Ireland to find the biological father. His name was Mickey McFinnigan, and he was the town drunk, which in that particular village was actually a position of some honor and distinction. The community respected its town drunk, which is exactly the kind of detail the show loved to drop into a travel episode. Peter and Mickey eventually connected over a drinking contest, and Mickey recognized Peter as his son when Peter was the only person in the village capable of keeping pace with him. Paternity confirmed by alcohol tolerance. The episode resolved itself in that direction, finding Peter a father who was alive and willing to acknowledge him, and the show moved on. Francis appeared one more time after that, in the 8th season episode Family Guy, which dealt with Peter discovering Jewish ancestry on his mother's side and considering what that meant for his identity. The show brought Francis back as a ghost, in the way that Family Guy occasionally used deceased characters, and his posthumous appearance was in keeping with who he had always been. He warned Peter about eternal damnation if he converted to Judaism. He was still arguing, still judging, still completely himself, even from wherever dead characters went when the show was done with them. It was not a flattering final note, but it was honest. The voice behind Francis was Charles Durning, a character actor with a long and accomplished career in film and television. Durning died in December 2012, several years after the character's death on the show. The timing meant that when Family Guy killed Francis off in 2007, it did so with the actor still alive and available. The decision to end the character was a creative one. not forced by outside circumstances. The writers looked at what was left to do with Francis Griffin and decided the most interesting move was to remove him from the board entirely and deal with the aftermath. That aftermath had real consequences for the show's structure. Francis had been a reliable source of conflict across multiple seasons. Whenever the show wanted to examine Peter's relationship with religion, with identity, with the expectations placed on him as a son, Francis was the mechanism that made those stories possible. Removing him meant finding other ways into those subjects, and the show did not always replace him directly. The space he left was not filled so much as redistributed, with different characters and situations taking on the weight that Francis had previously carried. What his death also did was confirm something that Mr. Weed's death had only suggested. Family Guy was willing to remove characters from Peter's immediate orbit. Not just background figures, but people who had structural roles in the kinds of stories the show told regularly. Francis was not a peripheral presence. He shaped who Peter was, or at least who Peter was in contrast to him. Killing Francis meant accepting that those contrasts would have to be built differently going forward, and the show accepted that without apparent hesitation. There is a version of the story where Francis eventually mellowed, where some season 14 episode found Peter and his father finally arriving at genuine warmth, and the character rode off into a dignified late series exit. Family Guy did not tell that story. Instead, it told the story where Peter dressed as a clown at a birthday party and accidentally crushed his father with a unicycle, and Francis's last words were what they were, and 40 years of unexpressed feelings died with him in that hospital room, and Peter went to Ireland and found another father who accepted him through the time-honored tradition of competitive drinking. Both outcomes feel true to the show. The unicycle is absurd, but the emotion underneath it is real. Francis never said what he actually felt, and then he ran out of time to say it. And the show understood that this is how things often go between fathers and sons who cannot find a common language. They circle each other for decades, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never comes, and then one of them falls off a unicycle, and that is the end. The birthday party setting was worth noting for one additional reason. Meg turned 17 that day. The episode was ostensibly in her honor, and she did not factor into the story at all after the opening sequence. Francis died at Meg's birthday party. Peter spent the episode dealing with the fallout, and Meg became a staging detail. The show did not comment on this. It was simply where the episode went. Francis Griffin is gone, and he has stayed gone, which for this show is the more remarkable fact. The character appeared from the very beginning, shaped years of storytelling, and was removed with a unicycle and a bread roll of momentum that had started one episode earlier with Mr. Weed. 2 deaths across 2 seasons, both of them permanent, both of them rooted in the specific texture of Peter's world. The pattern was establishing itself, and the show was not done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Francis Griffin's death was the first time the show removed someone from Peter's actual family and held the line. Next, the story of 2 characters who were shot dead on screen, whose killer then turned to the audience and promised it was permanent, and who came back anyway. Section 3. Vern and Johnny Vaudeville was dead long before Family Guy was born. The variety show format that had packed theaters in the early 20th century, built on quick comedy routines, musical interludes, and performers working directly to the audience, had been out of fashion for decades by the time Seth MacFarlane sat down to create an animated comedy for Fox. Most people watching Family Guy in 1999 had no personal memory of vaudeville at all. The performers who had made that world famous were gone. The theaters that had housed them had closed or been converted into something else, and the whole sensibility had passed into a category of cultural history that people studied rather than experienced. Vern and Johnny existed because MacFarlane loved that world anyway. MacFarlane's affection for old-timey music and performance styles ran deep and showed up across everything he made. He recorded albums of standards. He filled his shows with musical moments that referenced a style of entertainment his viewers had encountered mainly through black and white footage in documentaries. The specific register of performer he loved was the kind who worked with enormous confidence and complete sincerity, who delivered a routine in a formal manner and expected the audience to meet them there. Vern was built from that love. He was a small man in old-fashioned clothes who would materialize in the middle of whatever scene was happening, address the room as though performing for a packed house, attempt some kind of bit or observation, and then turn to his accompanist Johnny and ask him to play him off. Johnny never spoke. He sat at a piano, which appeared alongside him with no explanation, and played. The specific song he played every single time was Galloping Gertie, a piano piece by composer Sam Fontaine. That level of specificity was typical of McFarlane's approach to this kind of material. He did not choose a generic honky-tonk tune. He chose a real piece with a real name, and he used it consistently, the same song every appearance. Because the joke was partly that Vern and Johnny had exactly one mode and deployed it regardless of the situation they had landed in. The format never changed. Vern would set something up, it would go wrong for him in some way, and he would call for Johnny. Johnny played. The audience was supposed to find this charming or at minimum tolerable, and for a while, a portion of them did. McFarlane clearly found it charming. The joke carried a genuine warmth underneath the absurdity. A man with no appropriate context for any scene he appeared in, proceeding with full commitment anyway, relying on his accompanist to carry him through the gap between intention and reality. The problem was frequency. Vern and Johnny appeared often enough that the joke began to wear before it had fully worked. The structure of the gag required surprise, a sudden intrusion of vaudeville sensibility into a scene that had nothing to do with vaudeville. When the surprise is gone because the audience has seen the same setup enough times to anticipate it, the intrusion stops being funny and starts being familiar in the wrong way. Familiar in the way of something you know is coming and are not particularly excited about. Family Guy received feedback from viewers who felt that way, and the writing staff took that feedback seriously enough to discuss what to do about it. McFarlane acknowledged in later interviews that the show had leaned on Vern and Johnny more than it should have. The honest version of that admission was that the gag had been overused, that the well had run low, and that something needed to be done. The question was what? The easiest choice would have been to simply stop using them, to let the characters fade out through absence the way many minor recurring figures do on long-running shows. They would stop appearing, viewers would stop thinking about them, and that would be the end of it without any formal acknowledgement. Family Guy chose not to do it that way. Instead, in the 4th episode of Season 5, an episode called Saving Private Brian, the show gave Vern and Johnny a send-off that was direct, violent, and addressed the audience without any pretense of subtlety. Saving Private Brian was primarily an episode about Brian and Stewie accidentally enlisting in the military and being sent to basic training. That storyline occupied most of the episode. Partway through, in the middle of a scene that had nothing particular to do with anything, Vern appeared. He launched into his standard routine. He set something up, it went wrong, and he turned to call for Johnny. Before Johnny could play a single note, Stewie produced a weapon and shot them both dead. Not in a cutaway, not as an imagined sequence. On screen, in the episode's actual continuity, Stewie shot Vern and Johnny. Then Stewie turned to face the audience directly and announced that Vern and Johnny were dead, that they would not be returning, and that the show was done with them. The delivery was flat and deliberate. There was no joke layered underneath the statement. It was a direct address, a production decision voiced through a character, a note to the audience that this particular running gag was being retired by force rather than neglect. Breaking the fourth wall was not unusual for Family Guy. The show had always been comfortable acknowledging its own artificiality, letting characters reference the fact that they were on television, having Stewie in particular wink at the audience when the plot called for it. But this was different from a casual fourth-wall gag. This was the show using that technique for a specific administrative purpose, to close a chapter formally, with a gun and a direct statement, in a way that left no ambiguity about intent. Stewie was the right character to do it. By Season 5, Stewie had developed into something more flexible than his original villainous baby concept. He was the character most openly aware of the show's conventions, most willing to comment on them, most capable of functioning as a kind of internal critic. Putting the announcement in his mouth gave it an authority that it would not have had coming from Peter or Brian. Stewie saying they were gone carried weight because Stewie operated at that level, slightly outside the normal rules of the show, able to see and address things the other characters could not. The fan response to the death was not what anyone expected. A portion of the audience, the people who had complained about Vern and Johnny appearing too often, were satisfied. The gag was over. The show had acknowledged the problem and dealt with it decisively, and that felt like the writers listening, which audiences generally appreciated. But something else happened alongside that reaction. A different portion of the audience, having watched the death occur and heard the formal announcement that Vern and Johnny would not return, found that they missed them. Absence produced a fondness that presence had failed to generate. Vern and Johnny, with their routine intact and available, were an annoyance. Vern and Johnny removed from the show and declared permanently gone were suddenly something to mourn. or at least something to remember more warmly than their appearances had warranted. This is a well-documented phenomenon, the way loss changes the value of what was lost, but it still surprised people a little when it happened with two vaudeville characters from an animated comedy. The show tested that fondness in the 6th season. An episode called Back to the Woods, which centered on James Woods stealing Brian's identity, included a brief appearance by Vern, not a living Vern, a ghost Vern, transparent and doing his standard routine from somewhere just beyond the regular plane of existence. He went through the familiar motions, the setup, the stumble, and then he called for Johnny to play him off. The camera cut to Johnny, sitting at his piano. Johnny was in hell. The image showed him surrounded by fire, playing his instrument from what was clearly a place of permanent damnation. Vern looked at the audience and acknowledged that they were probably wondering why Johnny was in hell. Then, he explained that Johnny had liked little boys. The joke was dark in a way that reframed the entire history of the characters. Everything audiences thought they knew about Johnny, the silent accompanist who sat at his piano and played Galloping Gertie on command, had a new shadow over it. The show took a nostalgic, wholesome-seeming pair of vaudeville performers and placed one of them in hell on the worst possible grounds, delivered through the other's breezy explanation to the audience. It was exactly the kind of move Family Guy made when it wanted to prove that nothing was safe from examination, that the warm feelings audiences had developed for something in its absence would not protect that thing from the show's more corrosive instincts. The question that the Back to the Woods appearance raised was whether Vern and Johnny should even be on a list of characters who were killed and never brought back. They did return, in a manner. Vern appeared as a ghost. Johnny appeared in hell. Both of them were visible on screen after Stewie had declared them permanently gone. If the standard for returning is simply appearing in a later episode, then the return happened. The distinction worth drawing is between appearing and returning. Vern and Johnny as ghosts were not reinstated into the show's active cast. Their ghost appearance was itself a commentary on their deaths, a joke about what had happened to them rather than a reversal of it. They did not interact with the main cast in any meaningful way. They were not brought back to do the routine again with the same function they had served before. The appearance in Back to the Woods confirmed their deaths rather than undoing them, because the entire point of the scene was that Vern was a ghost and Johnny was in hell. That is not a return. That is the show revisiting the corpse to make one more joke about it. After that brief appearance in Season 6, Vern and Johnny stopped showing up entirely. The ghost version of Vern did not become a new recurring presence. Johnny's situation in the afterlife was not revisited. The characters had been given a death, a formal announcement, a one-episode ghost appearance, and then genuine absence that continued for the rest of the series. What Vern and Johnny's story illustrated was something specific about how Family Guy handled the problem of its own running gags. The show accumulated gags the way some shows accumulated cast members, building a library of reliable setups that could be dropped into any episode when the writing needed it. Some of those gags aged well and remained funny across many seasons. Others wore out faster than expected. The solution when a gag wore out was not always to retire it gracefully. Sometimes the solution was to kill it in the most theatrical way available, to make the retirement itself into a statement, so that the audience understood something had changed and felt the shape of the change clearly. Stewie shooting Vern and Johnny and then telling the audience they were gone was Family Guy treating a creative problem as a narrative event. The show had a gag it no longer wanted to use, so it destroyed the gag on screen and told viewers directly that the destruction was intentional. That transparency was unusual. Most shows simply stopped doing a thing without ever explaining why. Family Guy, at its most confident, preferred to address these decisions out loud, even if the address came through a homicidal toddler with a firearm. Vern and Johnny were not major characters. Their absence did not reshape the show's structure the way the deaths of Francis Griffin or Mr. Weed had. But their story was about something different from those deaths. It was about what a show owes its own history, about whether a running gag has the right to a formal ending, and about the strange loyalty audiences developed toward things they complained about while those things were still present. Vern asked Johnny to play him off one last time as a ghost in a Season 6 episode, and Johnny played from hell, and after that, neither of them appeared again. The routine was complete. The curtain came down, the house lights came up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Vern and Johnny were killed on a creative decision. Their deaths turned into a statement about the show's own habits. The next death was handled completely differently. driven not by the writers but by a voice actress who simply could not keep doing a voice that was destroying her throat. Section 4. Loretta Brown. Cleveland Brown had been part of the Quahog social circle since the very first episode of Family Guy. He lived across the street. He drank at the Drunken Clam with Peter and Quagmire and Joe, and he brought a specific energy to the group that balanced out the louder personalities around him. Where Peter was chaotic, and Quagmire was relentless, and Joe was rigid with professional obligation, Cleveland was patient. He was measured, he took things slowly, responded to provocation with calm, and had a quality of stillness that the show treated sometimes as a virtue and sometimes as the setup for a joke about how little it took to finally make him snap. He was a good neighbor, a loyal friend, and, for the first several seasons of the show, a married man. Loretta Brown was Cleveland's wife, and she was there from nearly the beginning. Her first appearance came in the second season, and she settled into the show as part of the fabric of Quahog life. She was part of the group of wives, seen alongside Lois and Bonnie at social gatherings, present in the background of scenes that required the neighborhood to feel populated and real. Her personality carried a sharpness that Cleveland's did not. She was direct, often demanding, and had a way of speaking to Cleveland that made clear who held authority in their household. The show used that dynamic for jokes, the patient gentleman and the abrasive wife. And it worked well enough across the early seasons without anyone looking too closely at the mechanics of it. The voice was central to the character. Alex Borstein, who provided the voices for Lois Griffin and several other female characters across the show, also voiced Loretta. The two voices required completely different physical approaches. Lois was pitched in one direction, relatively naturalistic, the voice of a woman speaking in a normal register. Loretta required something else entirely, a deep, gravelly, distinctly masculine quality that Borstein produced by pushing her voice into a range that put significant strain on her vocal cords. Sustaining that over the course of an episode was demanding. Sustaining it across multiple seasons of a television series was genuinely damaging. Borstein reached a point where continuing to voice Loretta was not sustainable. The strain on her throat was real and cumulative, and at some point, she communicated to the production that she needed the character retired. The specific mechanics of that conversation are not fully documented in public statements, but the outcome is clear from the DVD commentary that accompanied the relevant episodes. The writers were aware that Borstein did not want to continue doing the voice, and the decision was made to write Loretta out of the show in a way that would make her removal permanent. The episode chosen for this was The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, the 5th episode of Season 4, which aired in 2005. The episode was a serious one by Family Guy standards, dealing with Cleveland discovering that his wife had been having an affair with Glenn Quagmire, one of his closest friends. The discovery was not played entirely for laughs. The show gave Cleveland a genuine emotional reaction, let the betrayal land with some weight, and built an episode around the question of what happens to a friendship and a marriage when something that serious occurs. Loretta's explanation for the affair was that Cleveland's patience, the very quality that made him a good friend and neighbor, had left her feeling disconnected. She used the word passion, or rather the absence of it, as her reason. She had wanted something that Cleveland's measured, gentle personality was not providing, and she had found it in the least appropriate place available. The show did not ask the audience to sympathize with her, but it also did not entirely condemn her. It let the situation be complicated, which was a slightly unusual choice for a show that usually preferred its emotional moments clean and brief. Cleveland and Loretta separated after that episode. The marriage was over. Cleveland took the split with his characteristic steadiness, which the show acknowledged and then moved past. Loretta remained in Quahog for a period, living in the house that Cleveland had effectively lost in the divorce settlement. She made a few more appearances across later Family Guy seasons, including a moment in a Season 7 episode where a plot involving Brian and Stewie created false hope for a reconciliation that Cleveland refused to pursue. He told her, gently but clearly, that their relationship was in the past and that both of them needed to move forward. That exchange was essentially the last meaningful thing Loretta did in Family Guy proper. She had been retired as a recurring presence, reduced to occasional appearances that served specific plot functions, rather than making her part of the ongoing ensemble. The voice problem had been managed by reducing her presence rather than by replacing the voice, which meant that whenever Loretta did appear in those later Family Guy seasons, Borstein was still providing the voice, but doing so infrequently enough that the toll was manageable. The permanent removal came from an entirely different show. When the Cleveland show launched in 2009, It followed Cleveland after he left Quahog and relocated to Stool Bend, Virginia, his childhood hometown. The spin-off gave Cleveland a new family and a new supporting cast, and it needed to address what had happened to Loretta in a way that gave Cleveland a clean emotional slate for his new life. The solution the writers arrived at was to kill her. The episode was called Gone with the Wind, and it aired during the first season of The Cleveland Show. The manner of Loretta's death was constructed as a direct reference to one of the most durable running gags in Family Guy's history. Throughout the original show's early seasons, there was a recurring joke built around Cleveland's bathroom. Peter, in the course of various mishaps, would send something crashing into the side of Cleveland's house, and every time this happened, Cleveland would be in the bathtub. The impact would send the tub through the wall and out into the yard, and Cleveland would ride it down to the ground, landing on the lawn, still in the tub, somehow unharmed, always delivering his reaction in his characteristic unhurried way. The gag repeated itself across multiple episodes, always structured the same way, always landing the same beat. Gone with the Wind killed Loretta by running the same gag, with a different victim and a fatal outcome. Peter, in the course of something that required a dinosaur skeleton to be moved, accidentally dropped it onto the house where Loretta was living. She was in an upstairs bathtub when the skeleton came down on the building. The impact sent her through the wall and out of the house, and unlike Cleveland, who had survived the same physical sequence many times across Family Guy's run, Loretta did not survive it. She fell, first time. The joke was layered in ways that rewarded anyone who had watched enough Family Guy to recognize the original gag. The bathtub fall had always been absurd, the kind of thing that could only happen in a cartoon, the kind of thing that worked because the audience understood that Cleveland could not be hurt by it. Running the gag on Loretta and changing the outcome made a specific point about the difference between the two characters. Cleveland's survival of the tub gag was charmed, the show protecting its own character from consequences. Loretta's death in the same scenario was the show making clear that the charm did not extend to her, that her status in the narrative was different, that she had already been written out of the protected circle. The scene following Loretta's death was the one that drew the most attention and the most criticism. Peter and Quagmire arrived at the scene, found her body, and proceeded to say negative things about her. Quagmire in particular had information about Loretta's history, and he shared it with Cleveland's new wife, Donna, in a way that was meant to close the book on Loretta's character entirely. The show confirmed that she had been unfaithful, not just with Quagmire, but with a list of other figures from Quahog, which the show treated as a final editorial comment on who she had been. The list was played for dark comedy, delivered in the tone the show used when it wanted to be shocking without quite committing to being sad about it. Peter also appeared in the aftermath, and his behavior around Loretta's body was not respectful. The scene drew criticism from viewers who felt it went too far, who thought the show had treated a character's death as an opportunity to pile on, rather than to simply close a storyline. Whether that criticism was fair depended on what standards were being applied to a show that had always been willing to use dark material for comedy, but the discomfort was real enough to register. What the scene accomplished, beyond the immediate jokes, was finality. Loretta Brown was not coming back. The spin-off had killed her in a way that could not be easily reversed, in an episode that was clearly intended to give Cleveland's story a clean departure point from everything the original show had established. After that episode, Cleveland's life in Stool Bend was entirely his own, with a new family and a new set of relationships that did not require constant reference to his first marriage. The Cleveland show ran for 4 seasons before being canceled in 2013. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy the following year, he came back as a widower, Loretta's death still part of his history, the new family from the spin-off incorporated into his ongoing storyline on the original show. The death had stuck. When Family Guy needed Cleveland back in Quahog, it did not resurrect Loretta to go with him. It brought him back alone, and the absence was simply part of his new reality. Loretta's story is unusual in the history of Family Guy's permanent deaths for several reasons. She is the only character on this list who was killed on a spin-off series rather than on Family Guy itself. Her death was arranged primarily to solve a production problem, the voice strain that made continuing her appearances unsustainable, rather than to serve a creative vision about where her character needed to go. The manner of her death was a direct callback to a Family Guy running gag, which meant her exit was constructed in dialogue with the original show's history, even though it technically occurred somewhere else. And the scene following her death was treated with less care than most of the other permanent deaths the franchise had committed to, leaving a slightly uncomfortable aftertaste that the show never quite addressed. She was also, worth noting, a character who was written out of active rotation years before she was actually killed. The death in the Cleveland show was the formal ending, but the real removal happened earlier, when Borstein communicated that the voice was no longer workable, and the production began reducing Loretta's appearances accordingly. By the time Gone with the Wind aired, Loretta had already been gone from Family Guy in all practical terms. The episode on the spin-off was The Paperwork, the official recording of a departure that had already been completed. Alex Borstein remained one of the most important voices in the Family Guy universe, continuing to voice Lois and other characters for years after Loretta's exit. The decision to retire Loretta was not a decision to retire Borstein. It was a decision to protect her from a specific physical demand that the show no longer needed to make. The character was expendable in a way that the actress was not, and the show handled the situation accordingly. Cleveland Brown, for his part, continued on Family Guy after his return from Stoolbend, slightly changed by everything the spin-off years had given him, and slightly unchanged by everything that had always been true about him. Patient, measured, steady. The kind of man who could lose a wife to betrayal and then lose her again to a falling dinosaur skeleton, and still come back to the drunken clam and take his usual seat. The bar had a different bartender by then, which is a story for a later section, but the seat was the same. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Loretta's exit was driven by the limits of a human voice. The next batch of deaths came from a completely different direction. A single episode that gathered years of recurring characters into one room and then picked them off one by one, leaving several of them permanently gone. Section 5. Muriel Goldman and Derek Wilcox. James Woods threw a dinner party, and several people who attended it did not come home. The setup sounds like the beginning of an Agatha Christie novel, which was entirely the point. The Season 9 premiere of Family Guy, which aired on September 26, 2010, was a feature-length episode built as a direct homage to Christie's most famous mystery structure, the one where a group of strangers are gathered in an isolated location and begin dying one by one, while the survivors try to figure out who among them is responsible. The episode was called And Then There Were Fewer, borrowed directly from Christie's title, and it ran for close to an hour, which was unusual for Family Guy, a show that typically operated in 22-minute blocks and did not often attempt the kind of sustained narrative that a mystery plot required. Seth MacFarlane has cited this episode as one of his personal favorites from the show's entire run. That fondness is not difficult to understand. The episode was an attempt to do something genuinely different within the format Family Guy had established for itself, to tell a story with real stakes and real consequences, rather than relying on the cutaway structure that had become the show's dominant mode. The mystery format demanded patience, demanded that the audience track information across a long runtime, demanded actual payoffs rather than punchlines that dissolved into something else. For a show that had built its reputation on the opposite of all those things, the episode represented a deliberate stretch. The gathering was set at a large mansion on a cliff outside Quahog, owned by James Woods, the actor who had appeared as a recurring antagonist and occasional victim across multiple Family Guy seasons. Woods had been a born-again Christian in the period leading up to the episode, a fact the show had established, and he had invited the residents of Quahog to make amends for the various ways he had wronged them over the years. The guest list included virtually the entire supporting cast of the show: Peter, Lois, Brian, Stewie, Joe, Bonnie, Quagmire, Cleveland, and many of the recurring figures who populated Quahog's social landscape, all received invitations and arrived at the mansion with varying degrees of suspicion about why they had been asked. The atmosphere was immediately strange. Woods, in his reformed state, was warmer and more earnest than the manipulative figure audiences had come to expect from him. The house was elaborate and isolated. A storm was building outside. The elements of the mystery were assembled with care, and the episode took its time, arranging them before anyone died. The first death in the episode was actually James Woods himself, stabbed during a power outage in the house's darkened corridors. His death set the mystery in motion, gave the surviving guests a reason to be frightened, and removed the most obvious suspect from the board, which redirected the investigation toward everyone who remained. This being a mystery in the Christie tradition, the solution was not going to be the obvious one. Woods's death was later revealed to have not been permanent. His survival explained in a later season through the logic that he was a celebrity and had access to a secret science facility that brought him back. But that reversal came later. Inside the episode itself, Woods was treated as genuinely dead, and the story proceeded on that assumption. The character who actually drove the mystery was Diane Simmons, the long-serving news anchor who had worked alongside Tom Tucker for most of the show's run. Diane's story is significant enough to warrant its own section, and the full account of her motivations and her death belongs there. But Diane was the instrument through which Muriel Goldman and Derek Wilcox died, and that fact shapes everything about how their deaths need to be understood. Muriel Goldman had been part of Family Guy since the 3rd season. She was the wife of Mort Goldman, the pharmacist who had been part of the Quahog ensemble from the earliest episodes, and the mother of Neil Goldman, the awkward teenager who had spent years pursuing Meg Griffin with an intensity that she consistently and firmly rejected. As a character, Muriel functioned as part of the social background of the show, appearing at gatherings, contributing to group scenes, and carrying a specific personality that the show had built across many seasons of small moments. She looked almost identical to her husband. Both of them wore thick glasses, both of them had the same general physical type. Both of them moved through the world with an anxious awareness of everything that could go wrong at any given moment. The show found consistent comedy in the Goldman family's shared hypochondria, their joint certainty that illness and catastrophe were always one careless decision away. Muriel was the version of that anxiety expressed through a wife and mother, nagging and protective and completely convinced that the world required constant vigilance to survive. The irony of her death inside the episode was absolute. A woman who had spent years worrying about every possible threat to her health and safety was stabbed in the back by someone she had trusted to be a fellow victim, in a house she had attended in good faith, at a dinner party that had seemed like an innocent social obligation. All of her vigilance, all of those years of careful attention to danger, and what finally got her was a knife she never saw coming. She had discovered something she was not supposed to know. In the chaos of the mansion, with the power out and the guests scrambling to understand who was responsible for Woods' death, Muriel had pieced together enough information to identify the killer. The killer was Diane Simmons. Muriel did not get to share what she knew with anyone who could act on it, because Diane reached her first. The stabbing happened off-screen, which was the appropriate choice. The episode had already committed to a tone of genuine unease rather than graphic horror, and keeping Muriel's death just out of frame maintained that tone while still making the stakes clear. Mort's reaction to her death was one of the episode's stranger comedic moments. He stood before the group, ostensibly to say something meaningful about the woman he had spent his life with, and found himself repeatedly unable to complete any sentence that attributed genuine virtue to her. He started to call her young, stopped. He started to call her beautiful, stopped. He started to call her generous, stopped. Each time, he caught himself mid-word, some internal editor preventing him from saying things that were simply not true. What he arrived at finally, after all those aborted attempts at eulogy, was the plainest possible statement of fact. They had been married. That much he could say without contradiction, and so that was what he said. The joke was dark and also honest about something the show had never quite stated directly. Muriel and Mort were not a love story. They were a long marriage, which is a different thing, and the difference contained its own kind of sadness alongside the comedy. Mort's inability to produce a sincere tribute was not callousness. It was the result of a man trying to be accurate in a situation where accuracy was unkind. His settling on the bare fact of the marriage as the only statement he could fully stand behind was, in its way, more truthful than any polished eulogy would have been. After And Then There Were Fewer, Muriel simply was not there anymore. Mort continued to appear in Family Guy as a recurring supporting character, navigating his widower status in the ways the show occasionally acknowledged. An episode called Burning Down the Bayet, in which Mort got into financial trouble and Peter and Quagmire helped him hatch an insurance scheme involving the pharmacy, noted specifically that Mort had lost some of his edge without Muriel there to handle the difficult parts of running the business. She had been the harder one, the one willing to be unpleasant when the situation required it, and her absence left a practical gap that Mort was not equipped to fill on his own. Muriel's gravestone, glimpsed in a later episode, lists her lifespan as 1968 to 2010, which tracks cleanly with the airing date of And Then There Were Fewer. The show gave her a specific birth year and anchored her death to the episode's production period, which was a small but meaningful act of continuity in a show that often treated continuity as optional. Derek Wilcox occupied a very different place in the Family Guy ecosystem. Where Muriel had been present for years and carried the weight of accumulated history, Derek was relatively new, introduced as the man who had married Jillian, Brian's former girlfriend. Jillian had been a recurring character across several seasons, a sweet and genuinely simple young woman whom Brian had dated despite the obvious mismatch in their intellectual capacities. Their relationship had ended, as Brian's relationships tended to, and Jillian had eventually married Derek, who represented everything Brian was not. Derek was handsome, successful, good-natured, and patient with Jillian, in a way that Brian had sometimes failed to be. He was better than Brian in essentially every measurable dimension, which was the joke the character existed to make. Brian's discomfort around Derek was the discomfort of encountering a man who occupied the position you had vacated and was doing it better than you had managed. Derek did not gloat about this. He was not malicious or even particularly aware of the dynamic. He was simply a good person, which somehow made it worse. His death scene inside And Then There Were Fewer contained what might be the funniest line in the entire episode. Derek encountered the killer in the darkened corridors of the mansion, recognized who was responsible for the deaths that had already occurred, and addressed this person directly. The line he delivered was constructed as a classic horror movie moment, the victim realizing too late that they are face to face with the danger. He said, with complete sincerity and the kind of open-faced surprise that defined his character, that he could see the person before him, that he recognized them as the individual who had been killing everyone, phrasing the identification in a way that was simultaneously accurate and completely useless as a survival strategy. He was then killed by Diane using a Golden Globe trophy, which belonged to James Woods, and was therefore available to be used as a weapon, because the episode had been careful to establish that Woods was the kind of person who kept his awards displayed prominently. The joke in Derek's death scene was the same joke the character had always carried. He was good-hearted and sincere, and somewhat slow in the ways that mattered most for navigating dangerous situations. His identification of the killer was correct and delivered with full confidence and led directly to his death, because being correct was not sufficient protection in the circumstances he found himself in. The scene was funny in the way that only works when a character has been established well enough that the audience knows exactly what they are going to do before they do it. After the episode, Derek disappeared from Family Guy permanently. Jillian appeared in later seasons without him, her life having moved on in the way that lives on. Long-running shows tend to move on when the writers need a character to be available for a storyline. Derek was gone, and the show did not revisit him. He had served a specific function, the better version of Brian who gave Brian something to feel inadequate about, and that function had been completed. His death in the mansion tied off the loose end of his presence without requiring any further explanation. What the episode accomplished by killing both Muriel and Derek, alongside the other deaths it committed to, was the establishment of a specific kind of gravity that Family Guy had not previously allowed itself. These were characters with histories in the show. Muriel had years of appearances behind her. Derek had been introduced specifically in relation to an ongoing emotional thread involving Brian. Their deaths were not random, were not throwaway. They meant something in narrative terms, and the show confirmed their permanence through MacFarlane's post-episode statements on social media, making explicit what the episode itself had implied. These characters were dead. The other characters killed in the same episode were dead. The episode was canon, and the deaths would hold. That confirmation mattered because Family Guy had trained its audience to expect reversals. Brian had died and come back. Stewie had died countless times and come back. The show's relationship with death was so casual and so consistently impermanent that a truly permanent death required external confirmation to land properly. MacFarlane provided it, and the audience adjusted accordingly. Muriel Goldman's gravestone in a later episode did the same work quietly. A background detail, easy to miss, carrying the specific dates of a character's life and anchoring them to the real timeline of the show's broadcast history. That kind of detail is how a long-running animated series acknowledges its own past without stopping the present story to do so. Muriel was born, Muriel died, the years are on the stone, and the show kept moving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Muriel and Derek were killed by the same hand in the same episode, but neither of them is the most significant death that night at the mansion. The killer herself died too, and her story is the one that changed Family Guy's news desk forever. Section 6. Diane Simmons. Tom Tucker had a co-anchor, and she was miserable. That was the baseline understanding of Diane Simmons across the first 8 seasons of Family Guy. She sat beside Tom at the Channel 5 news desk and delivered the Quahog news alongside a man who treated her with a casual contempt that the show played for quick jokes. Tom would say something cutting, Diane would react, and the scene would move on. She was a fixture, a piece of the show's furniture, present whenever the plot needed a news broadcast to relay information to the audience or to the characters. The anchor desk was a narrative tool, and Diane was part of that tool, functional and reliable, and not given much more thought than a useful prop tends to receive. What the audience did not fully appreciate across those 8 seasons was how much history the show had quietly built into Diane's character, without ever making it the center of anything. She had hosted a talk show called Diane, which the Griffins had appeared on and used as an opportunity to expose family secrets to a live studio audience. She had been Tom Tucker's professional partner through years of on-air bickering that suggested a relationship with roots much deeper than simple workplace tension. She had been around long enough and had been given enough small specific details across enough episodes that when the show finally decided to make her the center of a story, there was genuine substance to work with. The decision to build the Season 9 premiere around Diane came from a desire to do something the show had not done before. The writers wanted a mystery, wanted real stakes, wanted an episode that asked the audience to pay attention across a long runtime, and rewarded that attention with a payoff that felt earned. For that to work, the killer could not be a character introduced specifically for the episode. The killer had to be someone familiar, someone whose presence in the mansion full of Quahog residents made complete sense, someone the audience had been watching for years without ever imagining them capable of what they turned out to be capable of. Diane fit that requirement better than almost any other recurring character could have. She had spent 8 seasons in a supporting role, visible without being examined, present without being understood. Turning her into the villain of the piece was not a betrayal of who she had been. It was a revelation of who she had always been, underneath the professional surface and the on-air composure. Her motivations were grounded in things the show had already established. Tom Tucker had arranged to have her replaced at the anchor desk with a younger woman. That replacement had cost Diane the career she had built over decades. James Woods, the actor who had invited everyone to the mansion under the pretense of making amends, had been involved with Diane romantically. Their relationship had been a secret, which meant that when Woods ended it, he ended it without any public acknowledgement of what it had been, leaving Diane to absorb the loss privately while maintaining her professional face. Woods had ended the relationship specifically because Diane had turned 40, which he reportedly found disqualifying. The combination of those two losses, the career taken by a man who found her too old, and the relationship ended by a man for the same reason, had pushed Diane toward a plan that the episode revealed in careful stages. She had arranged for Woods to become a born-again Christian, so that he would feel compelled to gather the people he had wronged and make amends. She had done this knowing that she would be among the guests, knowing what she intended to do when she got there, knowing that the gathering would give her access to Woods in a setting where suspicion could be directed elsewhere. The plan was to kill Woods and frame Tom Tucker for the murder. Everything else that happened in the mansion that night was collateral. People who had seen or learned too much. People who had been in the wrong place. People who had died because Diane needed to protect the plan she had set in motion. Stephanie died first, killed accidentally by a trap Diane had set for Woods. Then Woods himself was stabbed in the darkness of a power outage. Then Priscilla, who knew too much. Then Muriel Goldman, who had figured out the truth. Then Derek Wilcox, who had identified the killer out loud at the worst possible moment for his own survival. By the time morning came and Tom Tucker had been arrested, Diane seemed to have succeeded. The mansion was full of bodies. The obvious suspect was in custody, and Diane was preparing to return to a news desk she would now have to herself, the co-anchor position suddenly vacant in a way that served her perfectly. Lois was the one who unraveled it. The conversation between them was built on a single detail: the dress. Diane mentioned a dress her mother had bought her for her first solo broadcast. Lois processed that detail and found the edges of it did not match the timeline Diane had presented. A dress bought in anticipation of a solo broadcast that had not existed until Tom Tucker was arrested that very morning. A dress purchased before the night's events, which meant the night's events had been planned in advance, which meant the woman standing in front of Lois had known exactly what was going to happen and had prepared accordingly. Diane pulled a gun. She had come this far, had done everything she had done, and was not going to let a conversation about a dress take everything apart. She walked Lois to the edge of the cliff that the mansion overlooked, intending to shoot her and make it look like an accident, a guest who had slipped in the chaos of the terrible night, a tragedy layered on top of tragedies. She explained herself while she walked Lois there, because the scene required explanation and because Diane had been holding all of this inside for long enough that the release of saying it out loud seemed to matter to her. She talked about turning 40. She talked about what Tom had done to her career. She talked about what Woods had done to her personally. The show gave her enough space in that conversation to be comprehensible, to lay out the logic of how a person arrives at murder through a series of smaller losses that compound into something unbearable. Diane was not presented as purely monstrous. She was presented as a person who had been genuinely wronged, who had channeled those wrongs into something catastrophic, whose choices were unforgivable, while her grievances were recognizable. Then, Stewie shot her. The shot came from an upstairs window of the mansion, fired through a suppressed sniper rifle that Stewie had somehow acquired and positioned himself with during the conversation below. The bullet hit Diane in the back. She lost her balance at the edge of the cliff, and she fell. The fall ensured that the shot alone left no ambiguity about survival. A sniper round and a cliff together constituted a death without any reasonable alternative interpretation. Stewie's line after the shot was immediate and completely in character. He declared from his window that if anyone was going to kill Lois, it was going to be him. The joke worked because it was perfectly true to who Stewie was. The murderous infant whose entire ongoing relationship with his mother was built on a hostility that had softened considerably over the seasons, but never fully disappeared. Saving Lois from Diane was not an act of protection in any warm sense. It was a proprietary act. Lois was Stewie's to threaten, and Diane had overstepped. The humor of that moment did not cancel out the weight of what the episode had spent nearly an hour building. Diane's death was earned in a way that character deaths on Family Guy rarely were, because the episode had taken the time to make her story genuinely compelling before it ended it. She had gone from a piece of functional furniture in the show's architecture to the most fully realized villain the series had ever produced. And the transformation felt legitimate because the material had always been there, waiting for someone to actually look at it. Seth MacFarlane confirmed through social media after the episode aired that Diane and the other characters killed in the mansion were genuinely dead. The confirmation was necessary because Family Guy had established such a thorough habit of impermanent death that the audience needed external validation to accept a permanent one. MacFarlane provided it clearly. Diane Simmons was gone. The deaths in And Then There Were Fewer were canon. Whatever happened in future episodes, the bodies from that night would stay buried. The practical consequences for the show were significant. Diane had served a specific structural function across 8 seasons. She was one of the 2 anchors through whom Family Guy delivered news exposition, the information dumps that moved plots forward by giving characters a reason to hear about events happening elsewhere in Quahog. Tom Tucker alone could do that work, but the 2-anchor format had been part of the show's rhythm for so long that her absence needed to be addressed. The answer was Joyce Kinney, a new anchor who took the seat beside Tom Tucker in the episodes following And Then There Were Fewer. Joyce was voiced by Suzanne Plachette in her final role before her death, and after Plachette passed away, the character was recast and continued as a recurring presence in the show's later seasons. Joyce filled the functional role that Diane had occupied, but she was a different kind of character, with different dynamics with Tom and a different relationship to the rest of the Quahog cast. The anchor desk continued. The specific person beside Tom changed permanently. What Diane's death also accomplished was something for Tom Tucker's character that the show had never managed to do while she was alive. For 8 seasons, Tom and Diane had been defined in relation to each other, their on-air tension the primary thing that characterized both of them in those anchor scenes. With Diane gone, Tom had to be something other than the man who belittled his co-anchor. The show explored his character in different directions across later seasons, giving him a son and a backstory and storylines that had nothing to do with the news desk rivalry that had previously been his primary context. The actress behind Diane was Lori Allen, who had been with the show from the very beginning. Diane appeared in the first episode of Family Guy, sitting beside Tom at the news desk in that initial broadcast, and Allen had voiced her consistently across all 8 seasons of her life. The decision to kill Diane was a creative one, made without any of the external pressures that had driven some of the other deaths in the show's history. No voice actor had asked to be let go. No real-world event had made continuing the character impossible. The writers simply found a story that required a specific kind of villain, and Diane was the right character for it. And the story demanded that the villain die at the end, and so she did. That combination of factors, the long tenure, the creative rather than practical motivation for the death, the quality of the episode built around it, and the genuine confirmation of permanence from the show's creator, made Diane Simmons' death the cleanest and most deliberately constructed of all the permanent deaths in Family Guy's history up to that point. The show had not stumbled into it, had not been forced into it, had not done it as a quick joke that was never revisited. It had built a feature-length episode around it, had given the character a full and coherent arc across that episode, and had ended that arc in the only way that felt true to what had been established. Diane Simmons had turned 40 and watched everything she had worked for begin to slip away. She had made choices in response to that slipping that went far beyond anything that could be justified or explained away. She had ended lives because the alternative was accepting losses she was not capable of accepting. And then she had stood at the edge of a cliff and explained all of it to the one person who had figured it out, and then Stewie had shot her, and she had gone over the edge, and the show had confirmed that she was gone. The anchor chair that Tom Tucker had sat beside for 8 seasons was empty. Eventually, it was filled. The news kept happening in Quahog, and someone had to report it. But the woman who had been doing that alongside Tom since the very beginning of the show, through all the years of professional humiliation and on-air belittling and the quiet accumulation of losses that finally became too much to carry, was not coming back to that desk. She had gone the way the cliff took her, which was down and away and permanent, and the show kept going without her, the way it kept going without everyone it eventually decided to let go. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Diane Simmons died as the most fully realized villain the show ever produced. The next death came from a completely different corner of the Family Guy universe, an evil infant with a crossbow and a grudge that stretched across time itself. Section 7. Bertram Stewie Griffin had enemies before Bertram existed. He had his mother, whom he had been plotting against since the pilot episode. He had Brian, whose relationship with him shifted constantly between genuine friendship and mutual exasperation. He had the broader world, which failed to recognize his genius with a consistency that never stopped annoying him. But none of those antagonists occupied quite the same space that Bertram came to fill, because none of them were Stewie's equal. Lois was not a criminal mastermind. Brian was clever but not in the same register. The world was indifferent rather than actively hostile. Bertram was different. Bertram was operating at Stewie's level, from a position of genuine intelligence and committed malice, and their conflict was the closest the show ever came to giving its most unusual character a true mirror image to fight against. The origin story for Bertram was one of the stranger pieces of Family Guy mythology, which, given the show's general approach to mythology, is saying something. In the first season, Peter went to a sperm bank. This was played as a joke with immediate payoff. The kind of thing Family Guy did in those early years without any expectation that the detail would be revisited. Peter's genetic material was deposited, the episode moved on, and audiences filed it away in the same mental category as all the other throwaway gags the show produced, at a rate too high to track individually. The show came back to it. Bertram appeared first as one of Peter's sperm, visible to the audience during an episode that explored the world as Stewie imagined it to exist at that microscopic scale. He was not yet a fully realized character, more of an antagonist in a specific contained context, an opponent for Stewie in a world that operated by its own rules. Stewie attempted to eliminate him there, recognizing immediately that this particular competitor represented a threat worth taking seriously. They reached something that functioned as a temporary understanding, and the episode ended without resolution of what Bertram actually was, or what he might become. What he became was a child. Peter had donated sperm at some point in the years between his first and third seasons, and that donation had produced a baby who grew up in the normal world, outside the Griffin house, existing as a real person rather than as a character in a microscopic fantasy. Bertram was born, and he and Stewie became enemies again, in the way that people who have been enemies in one context often find their way back to conflict when they meet again in another. The specific logic of how Stewie recognized Bertram as the same entity from the sperm bank was the kind of thing Family Guy expected audiences to accept without interrogation, and audiences generally obliged. Wallace Shawn provided the voice. The casting was precise in a way that only became fully apparent over the course of Bertram's appearances. Shawn had built a career on a specific quality, the voice of a small, intelligent, slightly menacing figure who chose words with care and deployed them with an air of superior amusement. His most famous role had established the character type so thoroughly that his voice alone carried associations that the show could use without spelling them out. Bertram spoke like someone who had already considered every possible response to whatever was being said to him and had found all of them inadequate. He spoke like a person who had decided very early that the world was not quite good enough, and had no intention of pretending otherwise. The rivalry between Bertram and Stewie ran across several episodes before it reached its conclusion. The dynamic was specific and consistent. Bertram was not simply a villain in the conventional sense. He was a counterpart, someone who shared enough of Stewie's capabilities and outlook to make the competition between them feel genuine rather than one-sided. When Stewie had the advantage, Bertram found a way to close the gap. When Bertram seemed to have won something, Stewie regrouped. Neither of them was capable of fully defeating the other through any straightforward means, which was what made the final confrontation require such an extreme escalation. The episode that ended Bertram was called The Big Bang Theory, which aired on May 8, 2011, during the 9th season. The title was borrowed from the cosmological concept, and the episode used that concept in a way that was characteristically Family Guy, in its combination of genuine scientific interest and complete willingness to bend whatever rules were necessary to make the story work. The plot began with a small domestic dispute between Stewie and Brian, the kind of minor disagreement that their cohabitation in the Griffin house produced regularly, and escalated into something that encompassed the entire history of the universe. Stewie had built a time machine, which was established information by this point in the show's run. The machine had appeared in multiple previous episodes, had been used for various purposes, and had become part of the accepted furniture of the world Family Guy occupied. The time machine's existence was not unusual. What happened with it in this episode was, Brian and Stewie got into a physical confrontation over the controls. The machine was activated accidentally, and they were transported out of the normal space-time continuum entirely, into a region where the usual rules of physics did not apply and where the return function of the machine was unable to operate. Getting home required Stewie to overload the return pad in a way that would create an explosion, and the explosion that resulted from this turned out to be the Big Bang. The energy released by Stewie's return pad, in this specific corner of the Family Guy universe, was the force that had created all of existence. The show took this revelation seriously within the logic of the episode, while also treating it with the lightness that the format required. Stewie had caused the Big Bang. He was therefore, in some technical sense, the origin of everything. Brian's response to this information was to suggest that he deserved some credit as well, since he had been present, which Stewie dismissed by describing him as the Garfunkel of the situation. The joke was good and also efficient, moving past the cosmological implications quickly enough to get to the actual story the episode was building toward. Bertram had been watching. He had seen Stewie access the time machine, had understood its capabilities, and had identified the strategic opportunity this created. If Stewie was responsible for the Big Bang, then Stewie's existence was necessary for the universe to have come into being. Removing Stewie from history would therefore not simply kill Stewie. It would create a paradox that would unravel everything. Bertram, committed to his rivalry with Stewie at a level that most people would consider disproportionate, had decided this was acceptable. He would travel back in time and eliminate Stewie's ancestry, erasing Stewie from existence even at the cost of erasing everything else. The specific ancestor he targeted was Leonardo da Vinci. Stewie had determined through his research that da Vinci was part of the chain that led to his eventual birth, which meant that killing da Vinci would break that chain. Bertram went back to Renaissance Italy, found da Vinci in his workshop, and killed him. The act was committed with full knowledge of the consequences. Stewie had warned Bertram, directly and explicitly, that killing da Vinci would cause a paradox that would destroy the entire universe. Bertram had weighed this information and found it insufficient reason to stop. There was something almost admirable about the commitment. Bertram disliked Stewie enough to accept the destruction of all existence as a reasonable price for removing him from it. The show did not dwell on how extreme that position was, because dwelling on it would have slowed the episode down, and the episode was already carrying a lot of plot. But the implications sat there underneath the action, a character so thoroughly defined by a single rivalry that the rivalry had become more important to him than anything else, including everything. Brian and Stewie arrived in Renaissance Italy in time to encounter da Vinci before his death, and to be present in the aftermath of Bertram's act. The setting gave the episode its most visually distinctive material. The Stewie and Brian time travel episodes always produced an unusual aesthetic by virtue of dropping the modern characters into historical settings, and Renaissance Italy provided a backdrop that the show used effectively without making it the point. The point was Bertram and what needed to happen to him. The final confrontation took place in the manner of those aerial scenes that Da Vinci's flying machines made possible. The episode using the historical detail of Da Vinci's engineering interests to stage a battle in the sky above Renaissance Venice. Bertram had the upper hand at various points. He was not overmatched by Stewie in any obvious way. Their conflict was physical and tactical simultaneously. Two highly capable infants, fighting with the commitment of people who had been building toward this specific moment across multiple seasons and multiple episodes. Stewie won by getting hold of a crossbow. He shot Bertram in the chest. Then, because the chest shot alone left a theoretical possibility of survival, he shot him in the head. The second shot was the show being explicit about intent. One shot was a confrontation. Two shots, the second one to the head after the first had already found its mark, was a closing statement. Stewie was not leaving the outcome ambiguous. Bertram was dead, and Stewie had made sure of it. The episode then resolved its cosmological problem in a way that preserved the universe without contradicting what had been established. Da Vinci was dead, but Stewie took his place in the timeline, essentially becoming his own ancestor through a loop of causality that the episode gestured toward with enough confidence that the audience accepted it without requiring a complete accounting of the mechanics. Stewie had ensured his own existence by inserting himself into the chain that led to it. The universe survived. Bertram did not. Brian's complaint at the end of the episode was about the souvenir Stewie brought back from Da Vinci's workshop, a candle. Brian had wanted one of Da Vinci's original notebooks, which would have been an artifact of genuine historical significance, and Stewie had brought him a candle, which Brian pointed out was available in the present without any time travel at all. The exchange was the show returning to its default register after the episode's larger ambitions, landing on the specific texture of Brian and Stewie's relationship rather than anything grander. The universe had been preserved. Bertram was gone. These things had been resolved. The candle was inadequate. Bertram never returned. The show introduced a new infant antagonist for Stewie in the form of Doug, the toddler next door, voiced by Chris Parnell, who appeared in later seasons and occupied a similar structural role as a peer-level rival. Doug's eventual off-screen death, mentioned casually in a later episode as the result of a commuter plane crash, suggested that the writers had accepted a pattern where Stewie's infant antagonists did not survive long-term. Bertram had set the precedent for that pattern, the idea that a rival operating at Stewie's level was too volatile to maintain indefinitely, that the only way such a rivalry could end was with one of them permanently removed. Wallace Shawn's voice was specific enough that recasting Bertram would have been immediately noticeable, and would have raised questions the show had no interest in answering. The character was built around that voice, around the specific quality of intelligence, and contained menace that Shawn brought to it, and without Shawn the character would have been a different thing. The death of Bertram was also, in practical terms, the retirement of a performance that was difficult to replicate and that the show had used as well as it was going to be used. What Bertram represented in the larger history of Family Guy's permanent deaths was something the other characters on this list did not quite capture. Mr. Weed was a boss, a fixture of Peter's working life. Francis Griffin was a father. Vern and Johnny were a running gag with a shelf life. Loretta was a wife written out by a voice actor's physical limitations. Muriel and Derek were casualties of a mystery episode's body count requirements. Diane was a villain given a full arc and a deserved ending. Bertram was a rival. He was the character who came closest to matching Stewie, who operated on the same level, who represented the most direct possible challenge to the most unusual member of the Griffin family. His death was not incidental or logistical, or the byproduct of a larger story. It was the culmination of a specific ongoing conflict, and it required Stewie to be at his most decisive and his most ruthless to accomplish. The crossbow shot to the chest and then immediately to the head was Stewie at his most committed, making absolutely certain that the thing he was doing was done completely. The universe survived the death of Leonardo da Vinci because Stewie inserted himself into the causal chain and kept the sequence intact. Bertram had gambled that destroying everything was worth it to destroy his enemy. The gamble failed. Stewie lived, the universe lived, and Bertram died in Renaissance Italy, far from the Griffin house where the rivalry had been conducted, surrounded by the flying machines of the ancestor he had killed, shot twice by the enemy he had been trying to erase. That was the end of Bertram. Gone before Season 9 was finished, his exit handled in the same grand and slightly absurd manner that his existence had always required, because a character who began as a sperm in a bank and grew up to try to destroy the universe with time travel could not have been retired through any ordinary means. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bertram's death was settled in Renaissance Italy, centuries before Quahog existed. The next death happened much closer to home, on a softball field, to a man nobody worried about losing until he was already gone. Section 8. Horace and Thelma Griffin. Some characters earn their place in a show through what they do. They drive plots, create conflict, carry emotional weight, give the main cast someone to react to in ways that reveal character. Those are the figures that get remembered, that get written about, that get mourned loudly when they go. Then there is a different kind of character, one whose contribution is almost entirely atmospheric, who matters not because of anything specific they do, but because of the texture they add to the world simply by being in it. Horace was that second kind of character, and his loss revealed something about the drunken clam that nobody had taken the time to articulate while he was still behind the bar. He had been there since Peter and his friends had been there. The drunken clam was established early in Family Guy's run as the place where the social life of the male characters happened, the specific location that anchored their friendship in a physical space. Peter and Cleveland and Quagmire and Joe drank there, argued there, processed whatever the week had brought them in the particular way that men of that type process things, which is to say with beer and without any explicit acknowledgement that processing is what they are doing. The bar was a constant, and Horace was part of the constant. The grumpy presence behind the counter who served the drinks and occasionally contributed a line and was otherwise simply there. The show rarely gave Horace a storyline of his own. He did not have a family that the audience met, did not have ambitions that the show explored, did not have the kind of backstory that gets revealed across seasons of careful writing. He had a bar, and he had a gruff manner, and he had a way of reacting to the chaos that Peter and his friends regularly introduced into his establishment that suggested deep familiarity without any particular warmth. Horace was not fond of his regulars in any demonstrative sense. He was simply their bartender, which in the geography of that particular group's lives was a position of quiet significance. The Simpsons had Moe. That comparison was unavoidable, and the show itself acknowledged it in the episode that killed Horace, with Peter making a direct reference to Moe and the Springfield universe during his speech before the softball game. Moe was a fully realized character, neurotic and desperate, and capable of genuine emotion. Someone whose presence behind the bar was as dramatically useful as any of the main characters he served. Horace was not that. The show had never tried to make him that. He was a simpler figure, a bartender, in the way that a bartender in a background painting is a bartender, recognizable and consistent without being developed. Whether that lack of development was a missed opportunity or simply an accurate reflection of who Horace was meant to be is a question the show answered indirectly through how it handled his death. The episode was called Save the Clam, the 19th episode of the 11th season, airing on May 5, 2013. The setup was a charity softball game between the Drunken Clams team and Goldman's Pharmacy. Mort Goldman had recruited Jerome as a ringer for his side, Jerome being the former professional athlete who had appeared in previous episodes as a figure from the neighborhood's social orbit. The game was going the way charity softball games go, loosely and without particular urgency, until Jerome stepped up and hit a ball with enough force that when it redirected off another player, it caught Horace directly in the head. He died immediately, on the field, at a softball game, in front of his regulars, while playing for the bar that had been the center of his professional life. The manner of the death was as unglamorous as the character himself, a freak accident with a sports ball at a community fundraiser, the kind of thing that could not have been predicted or prevented, and that carried no weight of meaning beyond the pure fact of it. Horace did not die because of anything he had done or anything done to him with intention. He died because Jerome hit a ball very hard, and physics took it where it went. Jerome's reaction to having caused the death, however accidentally, was the most genuinely felt response in the episode. He expressed guilt that went beyond the social performance of guilt, a real reckoning with the fact that his participation in a friendly game had ended a man's life. Peter's response at the funeral was equally sincere in a way that Peter's emotional responses did not always manage. He told Jerome clearly that he did not blame him, that what had happened was a random accident, that Horace's death was not Jerome's fault in any way that mattered morally. The exchange was brief and slightly surprising in its directness, the show allowing a moment of genuine feeling to land without immediately undermining it with a joke. The aftermath of Horace's death took up most of the episode's plot, and the direction it went in said something important about what Horace had actually represented. Without Horace, the Drunken Clam had no owner, And without an owner, the bar's financial situation became suddenly visible. Horace had been operating the clam at a loss, carrying debt that exceeded the value of the property itself. When the bank became aware that he had died, the foreclosure process began almost immediately, and Peter, Joe, and Quagmire found themselves facing the loss not just of the man who had poured their drinks, but of the place itself. The scramble to save the bar gave the episode its structure and revealed the depth of what the drunken clam meant to the group, in a way that having Horace alive and present had never required them to articulate. They had taken the bar for granted because Horace had made it possible to take it for granted. His gruff reliability, the thing that ensured the place was always there when they needed it. Losing Horace meant confronting the possibility of losing the physical space that organized their friendship, and the episode used that possibility to make the characters say things about what the bar meant that they had never needed to say before. Jerome resolved the situation by purchasing the drunken clam himself. His guilt about Horace's death translated into a practical act of restitution, buying the property that his home run had effectively rendered ownerless, and taking on the role of bartender in the place of the man whose death he had caused. The resolution was clean in the way that Family Guy resolutions often were, arriving at an ending that solved the immediate problem while also acknowledging that what had been lost could not be replaced, only continued differently. Jerome as the new bartender was a meaningful shift in the show's texture. He was a more active presence than Horace had been, more willing to participate in the conversations happening on his side of the bar, more developed as a character in his own right. His tenure at the Clam changed the dynamic of those scenes in ways that accumulated gradually across later seasons. The bar stayed. The man behind it was different. Horace's absence was the condition that made Jerome's presence possible, and the show accepted that trade without sentimentalizing either side of it. Thelma Griffin's death arrived less than a year later, in March of 2014, in the 12th episode of the 12th season. The episode was called Mom's the Word, and Thelma's death was announced to Peter and to the audience in the way that news of a parent's death often arrives in life, not as the event itself, but as the report of the event, delivered by someone who was not there when it happened. Peter came home already distressed about an entirely unrelated embarrassment at work, expecting his family to have heard about it, and found them gathered instead with the information that his mother had died of a stroke. Thelma Griffin had been a recurring presence across the show's early seasons. She was Peter's mother, which gave her a structural importance in the family history, even if the show rarely made her central to any given episode. Her characterization was consistent and not particularly warm. She was a woman who had raised her son in circumstances that did not produce a thriving relationship. Her parenting captured in flashbacks that showed a history of neglect, punctuated by whiskey bottles thrown at minor childhood ailments. She smoked constantly. She gambled in Las Vegas with a dedication that suggested the casino was the environment where she felt most authentically herself. She had installed in her son a set of psychological patterns that the show occasionally referenced without ever fully examining. Her relationship with Peter was complicated in the specific way that relationships between emotionally unavailable parents and their children tend to be complicated, which is to say that the love was present but had been expressed so rarely and in such indirect ways that it had never quite registered as love from Peter's side of it. He had grown up without Francis's approval and without Thelma's warmth, and the show had used both absences to explain various things about who Peter was without ever turning either absence into the subject of a sustained emotional storyline. The episode built around Thelma's death was not primarily about Thelma's death. The show used it as the starting point for a story about Peter befriending his mother's friend Evelyn, voiced by Lauren Bacall, in what turned out to be her final television appearance before her own death later that year. The Evelyn storyline went in directions that had very little to do with grief or with processing the loss of a parent, and the show made no particular effort to disguise the fact that Peter's mother's death was functioning mainly as a plot mechanism rather than as an emotional event requiring sustained attention. That choice was honest in its own way. Family Guy had established across many seasons that it was not a sentimental show, that it did not conduct itself like the animated comedies that surrounded it in terms of how it handled the interior lives of its characters. The Simpsons would have made Thelma's death the center of an episode that took the loss seriously and drew genuine feeling from it. Family Guy made it the beginning of a storyline about an elderly woman making unwanted romantic advances toward her dead friend's son, and the discrepancy between what a more earnest show would have done and what Family Guy actually did was itself a kind of commentary on the show's relationship with its own characters. Stewie's response to the funeral provided the episode's other storyline, and it was the more emotionally ambitious of the two threads. Attending Thelma's service, Stewie encountered the reality of death in a way that made it suddenly personal. The understanding that everyone dies, that he would die, that this fact was not hypothetical but biological and inevitable, produced an anxiety in Stewie that the episode took seriously. He found he could not sleep. He sought reassurance from various religious traditions and found none of them adequate. Brian, in a moment of honest but badly timed atheism, explained his own belief that death was simply the end, that there was nothing afterward, and this sent Stewie into a spiral that the episode played partly for comedy and partly for something more genuine. The thread was effective because it used Thelma's death as a catalyst for something real, without requiring the show to make Thelma herself real in a new way. She could remain who she had always been, a somewhat cold and distant figure who had contributed to Peter's upbringing without distinguishing herself, and her death could still trigger genuine feeling by bouncing off a different character entirely. Stewie processing mortality through the occasion of his grandmother's funeral was the show finding the emotional content the episode needed, without having to manufacture feelings about Thelma that the series had never established. Thelma's voice had been provided by Carol Shelley in later seasons, following the death of the original voice actress Florence Stanley in 2003. The recast had been handled smoothly enough that casual viewers might not have noticed the transition, but it meant that by the time Thelma died on screen in 2014, she had already been voiced by two different actresses across her appearances. The death was not forced by the passing of a voice actor in the way that some later deaths in the show's history would be, but the casting history gave the character's tenure a slightly more fragmented quality than Thelma's structural role in the family might have suggested. Both Horace and Thelma stayed dead after their respective episodes. Neither character has returned in any meaningful sense, though both appear in the same hallucination sequence that briefly populated a later episode with deceased characters from the show's history, a vision Peter experiences of a cruise ship crewed by people who are no longer alive. The image is fleeting and functions as acknowledgement rather than return, the show's way of noting that these characters existed and are gone without reversing the decision to remove them. What Horace and Thelma shared, beyond their permanent deaths, was a quality of not quite mattering enough to mourn loudly while they were present. Both were background characters in different senses of the term, Horace literally in the background of the bar scenes, Thelma present in the show's family structure without being given the depth that depth of relationship might have warranted. Their deaths affected the shows they appeared in primarily by removing fixtures, by making the audience aware of gaps that had not registered as gaps until they opened. Horace's gap was physical, a bar without its bartender, a gathering place suddenly at risk of disappearing, a void that Jerome stepped into and made his own. Thelma's gap was structural, a mother no longer present in the background of Peter's history, one fewer connection to the past that had shaped him, one more empty space in the family tree that the show sometimes gestured toward and rarely explored. Both deaths were permanent, both held. The softball field and the stroke, the freak accident and the quiet medical event took characters who had been reliable fixtures of the Family Guy world and removed them without ceremony, which was perhaps the most honest thing the show could have done for characters who had never been given much ceremony while they were alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Horace and Thelma were taken by accidents of biology and physics, their deaths quiet by Family Guy standards. The next two deaths were anything but quiet, because they were not characters the show had invented. They were real people, and when those real people died, the show had to find a way to say goodbye that felt true to who they had been. Section 9. Mayor Adam West and Angela Peter Griffin's boss at the Pawtucket Brewery died swimming less than 20 minutes after she had eaten. That was the cause of death Peter delivered at Angela's funeral, and it was exactly the kind of absurd detail Family Guy reached for when the real story was too painful to handle directly. The real story was Carrie Fisher, who had died on December 27, 2016, and whose voice the show had no way of replacing and no intention of trying to. Family Guy faced that decision twice in close succession. Carrie Fisher, who had voiced Peter's boss Angela at the Pawtucket Brewery since the character's introduction in the 4th season, died on December 27, 2016, following a cardiac arrest she suffered on a flight 4 days earlier. She was 60 years old. Adam West, who had voiced the eccentric mayor of Quahog bearing his own name since the show's 2nd season, died on June 9, 2017, following a short battle with leukemia. He was 88. Within the span of 6 months, Family Guy lost 2 of its most distinctive recurring voices, and both losses required the show to acknowledge what had happened and to retire the characters those voices had made possible. The decisions made around both deaths were the same in their essential structure, and different in almost every other way. Both characters were killed off, rather than recast or quietly retired through absence. Both deaths were handled with a mixture of genuine tribute and the kind of comedy that Family Guy could not fully set aside even when the subject was real human grief. Both left permanent gaps in the show's ensemble that subsequent seasons had to navigate around. But the specific texture of each tribute, the manner of each death, and the place each character had occupied in the show's world meant that the 2 farewells felt very different from each other, despite their structural similarity. Angela had been part of Family Guy since the 4th season episode Jungle Love, which aired in September 2005. She was Peter's boss at the Pawtucket Brewery, a position that gave her a specific function in the show's mechanics. Peter needed someone at the brewery to react to, someone whose authority over him created friction and consequence, someone whose approval and disapproval shaped the professional context of his daily life. Angela filled that role with a directness and a sharpness that made her memorable across many seasons of appearances. She was not warm. She was not particularly patient. She held Peter to a standard of performance that he consistently failed to meet, and she expressed her frustration about this without any diplomatic softening. Carrie Fisher brought something to the role that no other casting choice could have replicated. Her public persona, shaped across decades of work and public life that included the Star Wars franchise, a career as a writer and performer in her own right, and a long history of honest self-examination about her own struggles, gave Angela a quality that transcended the specific jokes being written for any given episode. There was something in the voice itself, an authority and a wit and a particular kind of world weariness that had been earned through actual experience rather than performed, that made Angela feel like a person in a way that many supporting characters in animated comedies do not quite manage. The production's relationship with Fisher was warm enough that showrunner Rich Appel, speaking publicly about working with her, described a specific memory that captured who she was in a recording context. Fisher had once been waiting to record in the studio and had picked up a magazine. The magazine had a spread featuring her parents, Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds, with photographs of Carrie herself as a young child. She read the article aloud to everyone in the room, annotating it as she went, offering commentary on her own childhood as documented in a publication she had not seen before, turning the accidental encounter with her own history into an impromptu performance. Appel said she told him she did not need to keep the magazine. She had lived it. That quality, the ability to hold her own experience lightly while also taking it seriously, to find the comedy in the painful and the weight in the funny, was what Fisher had brought to Angela across more than a decade of appearances. When she died, the show did not try to find another voice that could approximate what she had provided. It wrote Angela out. The episode that formally addressed Angela's death was called Pawtucket Pete, the 9th episode of the 17th season, airing in December 2018, almost 2 years after Fisher's actual death. The gap between the real death and the fictional acknowledgement was longer than it might have been because the show needed time to figure out how to handle it, and because episodes that had already been in production when Fisher died aired before the tribute episode was ready. The show had honored Fisher immediately following her death with an in memoriam card at the beginning of the episode that aired closest to her passing, a standard television acknowledgement of a cast member's loss, but the formal farewell to Angela came later. The episode opened at Angela's funeral. Peter was delivering the eulogy, and the eulogy was built from television theme songs, a string of famous opening lyrics repurposed with Angela's name substituted in. The song from The Mary Tyler Moore Show giving way to the song from Friends giving way to the theme from Sanford & Son, each one reframed as a tribute to the woman Peter was supposed to be mourning. The choice was characteristically Family Guy in its approach to sincerity, finding a way to be heartfelt through comedy rather than despite it, using the familiarity of beloved theme songs to create an emotional effect that a straightforward eulogy might not have achieved. Then, the tribute shifted. Peter moved away from the song format and into something that read as a direct address not to Angela, but to Carrie Fisher herself. He described the character as fearless, spontaneous, honest about herself as much as about the world around her. He spoke of grace and courage, and a zest for life that was unmatched. And then, with the timing that Fisher herself would have appreciated, he delivered the Star Wars joke, saying that heaven had gained a princess, the line landing softly because it was true in more than one direction simultaneously. He acknowledged that her voice would live on in recordings, in small droid-projected messages. Then Peter realized he was at the wrong funeral. The joke punctured the sentiment at the exact moment the sentiment had reached its fullest expression, which was the show honoring Fisher in the most honest way available to it. Fisher had spent her career understanding that the comedy and the feeling were not in opposition, that the funniest moments often contained the most truth, and the most moving moments were often closer to funny than people admitted. Family Guy's tribute to her, in its structure, reflected that understanding. The wrong funeral joke did not undercut the sincerity of what Peter had said. It completed it, by making the tribute itself into the kind of moment Fisher would have appreciated and probably improved upon. Angela was replaced at the brewery by new characters in subsequent episodes, the practical work of the show continuing despite the loss. The position of authority over Peter remaining because the show needed that position to tell certain kinds of stories. The new figures brought in to fill that structural role were different from Angela in every specific way, which was the point. Not a replacement, but a continuation. The brewery persisting as a location, while the specific person who had made it feel a particular way was acknowledged as irreplaceable. Adam West's relationship with Family Guy was longer and in some ways stranger than Fisher's. He had been playing Mayor Adam West since the second season, and the character had been constructed as a specific kind of tribute to and parody of West himself. MacFarlane had been struck by West's performance in a Johnny Bravo episode and had built the Mayor character as an alternate universe version of the actor, eccentric and unpredictable, and operating with a total commitment to whatever strange logic the show put him in the service of. The character did not reference Batman. MacFarlane had made that deliberate choice early and held to it, wanting to keep West's presence separate from his most famous role, to let the show have its own version of Adam West, rather than borrowing from what everyone already knew about him. West had appeared in more than 100 episodes of Family Guy across 15 years of involvement with the show. He had voiced a character who had been a reliable source of a specific kind of comedy, the comedy of absolute commitment to an absurd premise, the humor that comes from a person who takes everything they do with total seriousness regardless of how strange that thing is. Mayor West had eaten a lot of cat food he claimed to be checking for safety. He had pursued various civic goals with a dedication that bore no relationship to their actual civic value. He had functioned as Quahog's elected official in the way that an actual eccentric might function in that role, unpredictably and memorably, making decisions that no policy framework could have predicted and that the residents of the town had apparently accepted because they kept voting for him. MacFarlane's statement following West's actual death was genuine in its feeling. He wrote that Family Guy had lost its mayor and that he had lost a friend. He described West's positivity and his sense of fun, his understanding of comedy, and his understanding of people, the energy he brought into the recording sessions that had made working with him a pleasure across many years. The tribute was personal rather than professional, the language of someone talking about a collaborator who had also been a companion, not just a voice that had served a character's requirements. The formal farewell to Mayor West came in the season 17 finale, an episode called Adam West High. The episode's main story involved Brian successfully campaigning to rename the town's high school after the late mayor, the school having previously been named after James Woods, whose reputation had made the name problematic. The campaign was won, the school was renamed, and in the final moments of the episode, Brian had an encounter with the ghost of Mayor West that saved his life. The ghost did not speak. West had been the voice of the character, and the show did not recast that voice or write dialogue for it. Instead, the ghost appeared silently, a presence rather than a performer, and saved Brian from a fall that would have killed him. The ambiguity of the moment, whether it was actually the mayor's ghost or a hallucination Brian experienced in a moment of crisis, was left unresolved, which felt like the right choice. The show was not trying to bring West back. It was acknowledging that his presence had mattered, that something of what he had been was still present in the world of the show, while simultaneously accepting that the specific thing he had provided could not be continued. The episode ended with actual footage of Adam West, real-world video from a promotional campaign he had participated in for the Family Guy mobile game, in which he asked viewers to vote for him as their mayor. The footage was not new and had not been created for the tribute. It was material that already existed, and the show repurposed it as a closing image, letting West speak in his own actual voice and in his own actual person at the end of an episode that had been building toward this final acknowledgement. The choice to end on real footage rather than animation said something about what West had meant to the production, that the character and the person had been genuinely intertwined in a way that the more conventional tributes to Angela had not required. Both West and Fisher had played characters who were deeply connected to their own public identities. Angela was not Carrie Fisher, but the voice was Fisher's, and the quality the voice carried was Fisher's, and there was no separating those things cleanly. Mayor Adam West was explicitly presented as an alternate universe version of the actual Adam West, a character built directly from the actor's persona and maintained through the actor's genuine participation across more than a decade. When these actors died, something that belonged specifically to them and that could not be transferred to anyone else died with them. The show made the right decision in both cases by accepting that truth rather than testing it. Other animated shows have recast beloved voices when the original performers died, and some of those recasts have been handled skillfully enough that the transition was managed without significant damage to the characters involved. Family Guy looked at Angela and Mayor West and concluded that recasting was not the answer, that what had made both characters specifically themselves was too tied to the specific people who had voiced them to survive a transfer. Mayor West's seat was eventually filled by a new mayor, Wild West, introduced in later seasons to serve the civic function that the show needed to continue telling certain kinds of quahog stories. Wild West was voiced by Sam Elliott, a choice that carried its own set of associations, and gave the new character a distinct identity, rather than attempting to approximate the old one. The mayoral office continued. The particular eccentric who had occupied it for 15 seasons did not. Angela's position at the brewery was handled similarly, the role of authority over Peter continuing through different characters who did not try to reproduce what Fisher had brought to the job. The brewery continued. The specific person who had made it feel a particular way was gone, and the show had said goodbye to her through a eulogy built from television theme songs and completed by a joke about being at the wrong funeral, which was exactly the kind of goodbye she deserved. Adam West died having voiced his own alternate self in more than 100 episodes of an animated comedy that had given him a second wave of genuine popularity, late in a career that had already included one of the most famous roles in television history. He had found, in Mayor Adam West, a version of himself that could be strange and committed and funny in ways that his public image had sometimes not allowed, and he had voiced that version with the same total sincerity that the character's comedy required. MacFarlane called him irreplaceable. The show proceeded to find a way to continue without him, as shows must, as life requires. But the word felt true in the context of what West had given Family Guy across those 15 years. The thing he had provided was his own. Both deaths stayed permanent. Neither Angela nor Mayor Adam West came back. The positions they had occupied were filled by different figures. The world of Quahog continued to function, and the two characters whose voices had gone silent remained silent. Family Guy had lost something specific and real in both cases, and it had acknowledged those losses in the ways available to it, which was through comedy that carried genuine feeling, through tribute that did not pretend to be anything other than tribute, and through the honest admission that some vacancies cannot be filled by finding a close enough approximation of what was there before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The deaths of Mayor Adam West and Angela were forced by real-world loss, and the show honored both with the tools it had. The final character on this list was not taken by anything outside the show's control. His death was a creative decision, and it ended one of the longest-running gags in Family Guy history. Section 10. Ernie the Giant Chicken. The first time Ernie the Giant Chicken appeared on Family Guy, the show did not announce him. There was no setup, no backstory, no explanation of who this enormous bird was, or why he existed in a world that otherwise operated by recognizable rules. Peter Griffin was walking down a street in Quahog. A giant chicken handed him a coupon. The coupon turned out to be expired, and Peter attacked the chicken. What followed was several minutes of brutal, escalating, elaborately choreographed violence between a heavyset middle-aged man and a 6-foot rooster, conducted across half of Quahog's infrastructure, leaving significant property damage in its wake, ending only when both combatants were too exhausted to continue. Then the episode moved on to whatever it had actually been about. That was Season 2, Episode 1, an episode called Da Boom, which aired on December 26, 1999. The chicken fight arrived without preamble and departed without explanation. A piece of absurdist action dropped into the middle of a Family Guy episode with the confidence of a show that trusted its audience to accept the strange without requiring it to be justified. The coupon was expired. That was the whole origin. A coupon, a chicken, and Peter Griffin's incapacity for proportionate response to minor inconveniences. What nobody could have predicted in December of 1999 was that this random piece of cartoon violence would become one of the show's most durable and beloved running gags. That the giant chicken would return in subsequent seasons for increasingly elaborate rematches. That the fights would grow longer and more cinematic with each appearance. And that Ernie, as the chicken came to be known, would accumulate across more than 2 decades enough history with Peter Griffin to qualify as one of the show's genuinely significant recurring characters. The coupon was a throwaway joke. The character who emerged from it was something the show would eventually spend 23 seasons developing before finally deciding to end. The name Ernie came later, as did the fuller picture of who the chicken was beyond his role as Peter's recurring opponent. He had a wife. Her name was Nicole, and she appeared in one of the later fight sequences, visible in their home during a chase that moved through the chicken family's domestic space, with the same indifference to property and safety that all the fights demonstrated. He had children. He had a son named Nugget, whose existence would eventually become central to the story of his father's permanent death. Ernie was not simply a force of nature deployed to fight Peter. He was a character with a life, however sketchily drawn, outside the specific context of their conflict. The fights themselves were the thing that made the character matter. Each one was constructed with more care than the show's format typically demanded, more attention to choreography and staging, and the escalating logic of action sequences that kept finding new ways to raise the stakes. The first fight had established the template: 2 opponents who were evenly matched despite the obvious absurdity of the matchup, who pushed each other through increasingly extreme situations without either one gaining a decisive advantage until they both simply ran out of energy. Subsequent fights honored that template while expanding the canvas. By the later seasons, the chicken fights had become events. Audiences who watched Family Guy regularly knew when one was coming, recognized the visual and tonal shift that signaled the show was about to dedicate several minutes to Peter and Ernie attempting to destroy each other across a new setting, and settled in for the spectacle with a specific kind of anticipation. The gag had its own economy, its own rhythm, its own set of expectations that the show was obligated to meet, while also finding some way to surprise. The fights were funny, but they were also genuinely impressive as pieces of animated action, crafted with enough craft that they stood apart from the show's standard visual approach. Seth MacFarlane's love for old Hollywood production values, visible in various corners of his work, found an outlet in these sequences. They referenced the physical comedy traditions of silent film and classic cartoons, the kind of elaborate extended gag that required genuine coordination between writers, directors, and animators, the kind of thing that could not be produced quickly or cheaply. Each chicken fight represented a significant production investment, and the show made that investment repeatedly across 2 decades, because the return on it, in terms of audience response, and the sheer entertainment value of watching 2 evenly matched combatants destroy progressively more of the world around them, justified the cost. Alex Sulkin, the show's executive producer, was direct about this in the interview he gave TV Line, confirming Ernie's death in October 2025. He described the fight sequences as something the production crew had been asked to do repeatedly across many years, acknowledged that they were demanding to produce, and said that the show had probably gotten everything it was going to get from the character. The production cost, in both time and creative energy, had reached a point where the return was no longer proportionate. The gag had been excellent and had run its course, and the show needed a way to close it. The closing came in the 5th episode of season 23, an episode called The Chicken or the Meg, which aired in 2024. The setup involved Meg Griffin, who had spent most of the show's run as its designated punching bag, the character upon whom Family Guy's more mean-spirited instincts were most consistently exercised. Meg began dating Nugget, Ernie's teenage son, after meeting him on a reality television program. The pairing was unexpected, and the episode used that unexpectedness well, finding something genuinely new in the combination of the show's most dismissed character and the offspring of one of its most recognizable recurring figures. Ernie's initial response to the relationship was positive. He welcomed Meg into his family with an openness that contrasted sharply with his history of violent antagonism toward her father. The chicken, who had spent 20-plus seasons trying to kill Peter Griffin, had no quarrel with Peter's daughter, and the episode played that distinction for something that resembled warmth, at least briefly. Meg and Nugget connected. Ernie seemed satisfied. The situation appeared to be resolving itself in an unusually pleasant direction. Then Ernie gave Meg an ultimatum. She needed to either cut her ties with Peter or stop seeing Nugget. The condition was non-negotiable. Ernie's feud with Peter had been running for more than 2 decades, and he was not prepared to have his son in a relationship with someone who maintained loyalty to his enemy. Meg was being asked to choose between her father and the person she was dating, framed as a matter of family honor from Ernie's perspective and as an impossibly unkind demand from any other perspective. Meg considered the ultimatum, looked at Ernie, and recognized something. The chicken standing in front of her with his non-negotiable condition and his long history of violent escalation was not fundamentally different from the man she had grown up with. Ernie and Peter were made of the same material, both of them creatures of stubbornness and disproportionate response and absolute commitment to whatever conflict they had found themselves in. The feud between them had lasted 20+ years, not because either of them had a genuine grievance that could not be resolved, but because both of them were constitutionally incapable of letting a thing go once they had decided it mattered. Meg walked out. Not toward Nugget, not toward a relationship that required her to disown her father, but away, having decided that the terms being offered were not acceptable. Ernie, having issued his ultimatum and watched it be refused, announced that he could not hit a girl and stood his ground. The scene paused at what seemed like a standoff. Then Meg decapitated him. The scene cut to Meg walking away from the confrontation, carrying Ernie's head, his body continuing to run around behind her for the few seconds that cartoon logic allowed before finally collapsing. The manner of the death was specific and extreme, and entirely in keeping with a show that had always treated violence as a form of punctuation, a way of ending a sentence that other shows might have finished differently. Meg did not simply leave. She resolved the situation in the most definitive way available, removing the head from the situation as literally as possible and walking away with the evidence. The death was shocking in a way that landed differently than most Family Guy shocks because of the weight of history behind it. Ernie had survived everything Peter had done to him across more than 20 seasons. He had fallen from great heights, been burned, been crushed, been hit by vehicles, been subjected to the full force of Peter Griffin's chaotic energy, applied with genuine malice, across dozens of confrontations. And he had always come back. His survival was part of the joke, the cartoon logic that kept both parties functional enough to fight again. The suggestion that any of these encounters was permanent had always been undercut by his inevitable return. Meg decapitating him with the same casual efficiency that she applied to everything she did was the show finding the one circumstance that the usual rules did not seem to cover. Peter had never decapitated Ernie. The fights had been brutal, but had operated within a specific register of cartoon violence that both parties understood and survived. Meg stepped outside that register entirely, applied a different and more final kind of force, and the result was permanent in a way that none of Peter's encounters had been. The question of whether it would stay permanent was immediate and genuine. Family Guy had reversed deaths before, including Brian Griffin's highly publicized death in season 12, which had generated enormous public outcry before being undone within 2 episodes through the mechanism of Stewie's time machine. The show had proved repeatedly that it was willing to undo a death when the creative or commercial pressure to do so was sufficient. Ernie had survived so many apparent deaths within individual episodes that audiences had no strong prior reason to believe this one was different. Sulkin's confirmation in October 2025 was what changed that calculation. His statement to TV Line was unambiguous. The chicken was gone. The production had gotten everything it was going to get from the character. The fight sequences had reached a ceiling that the crossover episode had made visible, and the creative decision had been made to close this chapter of the show's history permanently. The confirmation came 7 months after the episode aired, which was a longer delay than the confirmations that had followed the deaths in And Then There Were Fewer, but the substance of it was the same. This death was holding. Appel's contribution to the confirmation added a specific note about the production reality of the chicken fights, the demand they placed on the crew, the difficulty of continuing to top each previous sequence when the bar had already been raised so many times. The fights were genuinely expensive to produce in terms of creative and physical resources, and the question of what came after the crossover fight had never been satisfyingly answered. Ending Ernie was partly a creative decision about where the character's story had reached its natural conclusion, and partly an honest acknowledgement that the format the character existed to serve had been taken as far as it could go. What Ernie's death meant for the show was different from what the other deaths in Family Guy's history had meant, because Ernie's role was different from anyone else who had been permanently removed. He was not a supporting character in Peter's social world the way Horace or Mort Goldman or the other Quahog residents were. He was not a family member like Francis or Thelma. He was not a plot device like Derek Wilcox or a structural element like Diane Simmons. He was a running gag, the longest running and most elaborate gag the show had ever sustained, and his death was the retirement of that gag as much as it was the death of a character. Running gags do not usually die. They fade, they become less frequent, they are used more sparingly as the show finds that the returns have diminished, and eventually, they stop appearing without any formal acknowledgement that they have stopped. The chicken fights were unusual because the show had invested so heavily in them, had made them into events rather than quick jokes, had given them a scale that demanded attention rather than allowing them to pass unnoticed. Something of that scale required a formal ending, not just a gradual fading, and the episode gave it one. Meg, as the agent of that ending, carried a particular meaning that the episode seemed aware of. Meg Griffin had spent 20-plus seasons as the character upon whom the show's most casual cruelties were exercised, dismissed, and mistreated, and used as a punchline in ways that the other Griffin children were not. Giving her the kill, making her the character who ended the show's most iconic running gag while refusing an ultimatum that asked her to betray her father, was the episode doing something for Meg that the show had rarely bothered to do. It gave her a moment of genuine agency and made that agency consequential in a way that stuck. Peter's relationship with Ernie had defined the gag for 23 years. Meg's relationship with Ernie lasted one episode and ended it permanently. The symmetry was clean and slightly poetic in the way that things sometimes become when a long story finally finds its ending. The feud that had started with an expired coupon in 1999 concluded not with Peter finally winning a fight, not with Ernie walking away from a confrontation having had enough, but with a third party stepping in and ending the whole enterprise in the most definitive manner available. Ernie's headless body ran around the front yard for a few seconds and then stopped. Meg walked away. The 23-year argument between Peter Griffin and the giant chicken was over, decided by someone who had not been present for most of it and who resolved it not through the extended choreographed violence that the show had established as the appropriate register for this conflict, but through a single direct action that the usual rules of the gag had never accounted for. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.